Sara never believed in ghosts until she stepped into the house on Blackwood Lane. What was meant to be a fresh start quickly turned into a living nightmare. Whispers in the dark, shadows that moved on their own, and an eerie presence that watched her every step. As she delves deeper into the house's twisted history, Sara realizes she's not just haunted by the past. She's trapped in it, welcome to Ashes of Fear, where every creak in the floorboards could be your last. The story begins on a cold, rainy night. A young woman named Sara walks alone through an abandoned street, the only sound being the echo of her footsteps on the wet pavement. Sara was returning home from a late shift at work. The flickering streetlights cast long, ominous shadows that seemed to stretch out toward her. She quickened her pace, trying to ignore the eerie silence that surrounded her. Suddenly, she felt it, the sensation of being watched. She stopped in her tracks, glancing over her shoulder. Nothing, just the empty street behind her. She shook her head and continued walking. As she turned a corner, she saw an old house she had never noticed before. It stood tall and menacing, with broken windows and ivy creeping up its cracked walls. A sudden chill ran down her spine, and a whispering voice seemed to call her name from within. Curiosity got the better of her. She hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. The door creaked open on its own, inviting her inside. Against her better judgment, she entered. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Faded portraits lined the walls, their eyes appearing to follow her every move. She shivered but pressed on, drawn deeper into the house. Suddenly, she heard a soft humming. It was coming from upstairs. Her heart pounded as she ascended the creaky staircase, each step groaning under her weight. At the top, she found a dimly lit room with a rocking chair slowly moving back and forth. In it sat an old woman with hollow eyes and a sinister smile. "I've been waiting for you," the woman whispered. Sara screamed, stumbling backward as the woman's figure melted into darkness. The shadows seemed to close in around her, whispering unintelligible secrets. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut. Trapped, the house had claimed another victim. Sara's screams echoed through the empty halls as the walls seemed to pulse with dark energy. She ran frantically from room to room, but each door led her back to the same eerie hallway. The whispers grew louder, forming words she could almost understand. "Stay, forever." Desperate, Sara tried a window, but it wouldn't budge. A chilling laugh echoed behind her, and she spun around to see the shadows shifting, forming ghostly figures that watched her with hollow, soulless eyes. "Please, let me go," she cried, tears streaming down her face. But the house responded with creaks and groans, as if alive, feeding on her fear. She stumbled into what appeared to be an old study, the shelves lined with dusty books. One book stood out, an old leather-bound journal. With trembling hands, she opened it and read the words scrawled inside. "To those who enter, beware. This house feeds on the lost and the lonely. There is no escape once it chooses you." Sara dropped the book in horror. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the candle she had found, plunging her into darkness. In the pitch-black silence, she felt cold, bony fingers brush against her arm. She ran blindly, her heart hammering in her chest. As she reached what seemed like the front door, she threw her weight against it, screaming. Suddenly, the door flew open, and she fell onto the damp street outside. Panting, she looked back. The house was gone. Only an empty lot remained, filled with overgrown weeds swaying in the wind. Was it real? Or had the house simply moved on, waiting for its next victim? But the terror wasn't over. Days passed, and Sara couldn't shake the nightmares. She heard whispers in her apartment at night. Her reflection in the mirror seemed distorted, eyes sunken and hollow. Strange symbols appeared on her walls, written in what looked like dried blood. One night she woke to find herself standing in front of the same empty lot, her bare feet muddy and cold. She didn't remember leaving her bed. The whispers surrounded her, growing louder, calling her name. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The air thickened, pressing against her chest. Suddenly, the house materialized before her eyes, towering and more menacing than ever. The door creaked open once again, and the shadows reached out. Sara screamed, but no one heard. The next morning, her apartment was empty. The neighbors reported hearing strange noises, whispers, and distant screams, but no one ever saw Sara again. And the house? It waits, patient and hungry for the next lonely soul. Days turned into weeks, but Sara's disappearance remained a mystery. Her friends and family searched tirelessly, but no trace of her was ever found. The empty lot where the house once stood became a place of whispered rumors and fearful glances. No one dared to go near it, fearing they too might vanish. However, one person couldn't let it go. David, Sara's younger brother. Consumed by guilt and a burning need for answers, he spent his nights poring over every clue he could find. Old maps, news archives, and local legends all pointed to the same chilling conclusion. The house had a history, a long, terrifying history. Rumors of disappearances spanning decades filled the pages of forgotten police reports. Each victim shared one common trait. They were all lonely souls, seeking something they could never quite find. David couldn't help but feel a deep, gnawing fear that Sara had been drawn to it by forces beyond comprehension. Late one night, driven by desperation, David stood in front of the empty lot, staring at the overgrown weeds swaying in the cold wind. The streetlights flickered ominously, and an eerie silence settled over the area. As he stepped forward, a whisper drifted through the air. David, ... His blood ran cold. He spun around, expecting to see Sara, but there was nothing, just the dark void of the night. Swallowing his fear, he pressed on, feeling an invisible force guiding him deeper into the lot. With each step, the world around him seemed to change. The air thickened and an oppressive weight settled on his chest. Suddenly, the house was there, standing tall and menacing as if it had never left. The windows glowed faintly with an unnatural light, and the door creaked open slowly, beckoning him inside. He hesitated, but the sound of Sara's voice calling his name propelled him forward. Inside, the house was worse than he imagined. Shadows clung to the corners, and the air reeked of decay. The walls pulsed with a sickening, rhythmic beat, like a grotesque heartbeat. Faint whispers echoed through the corridors, and David's every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he couldn't. Not without Sara. He moved deeper into the house, his flashlight flickering as if struggling against an unseen force. The portraits on the walls followed his every move, their hollow eyes seeming to bore into his soul. He called out her name, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then he found it, the same study where Sara had discovered the ominous journal. The leather-bound book still lay open on the desk, its pages now filled with fresh writing. She is waiting. You are next. David's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, each filled with stories of those who had entered and never left. And then, there it was. Sara's name, scrawled in desperate, uneven handwriting. David, help me. A chill ran down his spine. He turned suddenly, feeling a presence behind him. A dark figure loomed in the doorway, its face hidden in the shadows. David's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, revealing Sara's hollow eyes and twisted smile. You shouldn't have come, she whispered, her voice distorted and wrong. David backed away, his heart pounding. Sara, it's me. We can leave together. She shook her head slowly. No one leaves. The house, it doesn't let go. Before he could react, the shadows surged forward, engulfing the room in darkness. David felt something cold and slimy wrap around his wrists, pulling him into the void. He screamed, fighting with every ounce of strength, but the whispers grew louder, chanting his name over and over. David, stay. Forever. With a final burst of energy, he broke free, stumbling blindly through the darkness. He reached for the door, his fingers brushing against the cold wood, just as the house let out a deep, guttural growl. The door burst open and he fell onto the street outside. Panting, he looked back. Just like before, the house was gone. David lay there, shaking and gasping for air. The lot was empty once more, but he knew the truth. The house wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching. And somewhere inside, Sara was still trapped. He swore he would find a way to bring her back, but deep down, he knew the house always got what it wanted, and it wanted him next. Weeks passed since David's terrifying encounter with the house, but the nightmares never ceased. Every night he saw Sara's hollow eyes, her twisted smile haunting him in his dreams. His obsession deepened. He scoured every inch of town records, seeking answers in forgotten archives, and speaking with those who dared whisper of the cursed house. One evening, David came across an old newspaper article buried deep in the library's archives. The headline read, "Local family vanishes without a trace. Only child found wandering the streets." The date was from 1952, and the accompanying photo showed a familiar sight, the very same house standing menacingly in the background. But what caught his attention most was the child's face, a young girl with hollow, empty eyes, her expression eerily similar to Sara's when he had seen her inside the house. Driven by newfound determination, David tracked down the girl, now an elderly woman named Eleanor, living in a care home on the outskirts of town. She sat in a dimly lit room, rocking back and forth in an old chair, her frail fingers clutching a withered locket. "The house took them all," Eleanor whispered before David could even ask. "It feeds on the lost, the lonely, like your sister, like me." David's breath caught. "Sara, is she still alive? Can I save her?" Eleanor's faded eyes met his. "Once it's taken someone, they're part of it. The house, it grows with every soul it devours. But there is a way." She shakily handed him the locket. Inside was a faded photo of the house, but beneath it, etched into the metal, were strange symbols David had never seen before. "Find the sigils," Eleanor rasped. "They hold the key. The house fears them. It's how I escaped. But I was too young to understand." David clenched the locket tightly, a newfound hope burning inside him. That night he returned to the empty lot, armed with the locket and a flashlight. The air was thick with a sinister presence, and as he stepped onto the lot, the house materialized once more, looming in the darkness. This time David was ready. He whispered the words engraved in the locket, and the sigils glowed faintly, casting a dim light onto the house's darkened walls. The whispers hissed in protest, the shadows recoiling slightly. Clutching the locket, he stepped inside. The house was different now, angrier. The walls pulsed like a living organism, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The whispers grew louder, desperate and pleading. He pressed forward, feeling the sigils guiding him deeper. At the heart of the house, David found a grand hall lined with mirrors. Each mirror reflected distorted images of those who had been lost to the house, faces twisted in eternal torment, and there among them was Sara. "Sara!" David shouted, reaching toward the glass. She turned to him, her eyes wide with recognition, but filled with fear. "David, you have to leave. It won't let us go." He pressed the locket against the mirror, and the glass trembled, cracks spider-webbing across its surface. The whispers turned into screams, and the house began to shake violently. A guttural roar echoed through the halls as the shadows surged forward, desperate to stop him. Summoning every ounce of strength, David recited the incantation from the locket one final time. The mirrors shattered, and a blinding light engulfed the room. Sara collapsed into his arms, trembling but alive. "We have to go," David yelled, dragging her toward the entrance as the house crumbled around them. They barely made it through the door before the entire structure collapsed into itself, vanishing into the void. Gasping for air, David held Sara tightly, the empty lot once again barren and silent. She sobbed into his chest, whispering, "You came for me." But as David looked down at the locket in his hand, he saw a single ominous crack running through the center of the sigil. The house was gone, for now, but he knew deep down it was only a matter of time before it returned, and next time it would be even hungrier. Days passed, and David struggled to believe that it was truly over. Sara was safe and the house was gone, but an unsettling feeling gnawed at the edges of his mind. The crack in the locket's sigil haunted him, a silent warning that the nightmare wasn't truly over. Sara, though physically present, was not the same. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in hushed, cryptic whispers. She would stare at walls for hours, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air, and at night, David could hear her murmuring in her sleep. He began to suspect that something had followed them back. One evening, David found Sara sitting in the dark, her eyes fixed on the corner of the room. "It's still here, David," she whispered. "The house. It left a part of itself inside me." His blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" She turned to him, and for a moment he saw something alien in her eyes, something that didn't belong. "It whispers to me. It wants to come back." Desperate for answers, David returned to Eleanor's care home, but he found her room empty. The nurse informed him that Eleanor had vanished without a trace 2 nights ago. On her bedside table, David found a single object left behind, a scrap of paper with the same sigils from the locket. But these were different, darker. A single phrase was scrawled beneath them: "The house never leaves." Determined not to lose Sara again, David sought out Father Matthews, a reclusive priest known for dealing with the occult. Inside the church's dimly lit chamber, the priest listened intently as David explained everything. When he finished, Father Matthews exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. "The house is ancient," he said. "It feeds on despair, on loss. You may have pulled your sister from it, but it still has a hold on her soul. We need to perform a cleansing before it takes her back." David agreed without hesitation, and they prepared the ritual for that night. Candles flickered around Sara as she sat motionless, her gaze distant. Father Matthews began the incantation, his voice steady but urgent. The air grew heavy and a suffocating darkness crept into the room. Suddenly, Sara screamed, her body convulsing violently. David held her down as Father Matthews continued, beads of sweat forming on his brow. The temperature plummeted, and a voice, low and guttural, echoed from Sara's lips. "She is mine." Father Matthews shouted the final words of the incantation, and with a deafening shriek, a dark figure erupted from Sara's body, dissipating into a cloud of black mist that vanished into the night. Sara collapsed into David's arms, her breathing ragged but steady. The priest placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "She's free, for now, but the house will return. It always does." David nodded, a steely resolve in his eyes. He knew this battle wasn't over. The house was patient, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to reclaim what it had lost. And David was determined to be ready when that time came. After all the horror, the fear, and the sacrifices, David and Sara finally found peace. The nightmares had stopped and the whispers no longer followed them. They moved far away from the cursed town, starting fresh in a place untouched by darkness. Sara, though deeply scarred, slowly began to heal, and David found solace in knowing he had saved his sister from the clutches of an unspeakable evil. The locket, now cracked and worn, sat safely in a locked drawer, a reminder of what they had faced and a warning of what still might linger in the shadows. Months passed and life seemed normal again. The siblings smiled more, laughed louder, and lived freely. However, deep down, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. One evening, as Sara prepared dinner, David sat on the porch, staring into the twilight. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the fading light painted long, eerie shadows across the yard. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, sending a shiver down his spine. For a moment, he thought he heard something. A faint whisper carried on the wind, brushing against his ear like a forgotten memory. He stood, heart pounding, scanning the empty yard. "Just my imagination," he muttered, but his voice wavered. From inside, Sara called out, her tone light but edged with unease. "Everything okay?" David forced a smile. "Yeah, just the wind. But some things never truly leave. Do you believe that some places can truly be haunted, or is it all in the mind? What lengths would you go to in order to save a loved one from the unknown? If faced with an unspeakable evil, would you fight or run? Do you think David and Sara are truly free, or is their battle just beginning? Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey through the Whispering Walls. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Ashes of Fear for more spine-chilling tales. Until next time, stay safe and beware of the whispers in the dark. Horror stories, sleep asleep. Stories for adults, sleep to scary story compilation. Fall asleep to chilling truths. Adult horror stories to relax. True uninvited houseguest horror stories. Scared to sleep. Adult horror stories. True horror stories. Scary stories. Bedtime stories. Sleep stories. Terrifying, terrifying tales. Ghost stories to sleep. True scary stories. Horrifying. Rain sounds. Adult stories. Horror to sleep. Fear and sleep stories. Real relax.